Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss one of the measures that the government put in place to tackle food shortages as a result of a knee-jerk reaction to damaging headlines in the national media last week. Unfortunately, because the policy was a knee-jerk reaction and not as a result of careful planning, it's all gone a little bit wrong, to the point where someone in the food distribution industry has accused the government of actually just making things worse. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So the food shortages are getting more desperate again. My favourite image from this weekend was this one on Twitter of the berries section of Tesco, filled to the brim, mushrooms. All part of fooling people that shortages aren't there. Obviously, you'd notice if you wanted some raspberries, but if you're just going past the aisle, all you see is food where food should be. That's the idea of deceptions like this. Most people are fooled because they just see food on the shelves, don't pay attention to it. No one's going to look if it's the right food. But little tricks aside, which from the government's point of view acts to hide their incompetence, and from the supermarket's point of view prevents panic buying, which would do nobody any good at all, just make the whole situation a lot worse, something does need to be done. Now, I talked about the way that it is actually Brexit that has led to a sudden and critical shortage of lorry drivers in the country, but the media are concerned only with the so-called Pingdemic. Even though the food shortages are not evidenced in other EU countries, which also have a pandemic on and also have COVID apps telling people to isolate. But do you know what they don't have? They don't have Brexit. But workers having to isolate due to massive recent surges in the Johnson variant is still a serious problem, because it's still, what have we got? Like 1 million people last week isolating? And it's one that the government have tried to get involved in. As a result of the headlines last week, nothing else, just the headlines, the government announced plans to let double-jabbed workers in certain critical areas, as long as they're getting negative COVID tests each day, although that's lateral flow test COVID tests, to ignore the isolate instruction. But here's the problem. It isn't enough for the government to announce this, because the order to isolate, if you're told to do so, is not guidance, it's the law. If you are told that you need to isolate by any part of what's left of our test and trace system, including the app, and you don't, you are breaking the law. And there are hefty fines that can await you. In fact, if your employer allows you into work knowing that you should be isolating, then they can also be punished with a fine starting from £1,000. So those who are permitted to ignore the instruction to isolate, which is a legal requirement, they need something from the government specifically naming their workers who can take part in this exemption. Now, for me, there are still legal questions around it, but I'm not a legal expert. Like, if the letter exempts you from isolating for the purposes of work, what around doing that work does it also cover? Are you allowed to use public transport to get to work, for example? Can you nip out for some lunch? I'm not sure it's as thorough as we might like. But never mind, they have this policy, and truth be told, if a minister writes a letter saying that your business can engage in this directive, I hardly think a prosecutor is going to consider it in the public's interest to prosecute a worker who has been named as being able to ignore it for the purposes of work and clobbering them for getting a sandwich, even though that is a higher risk than should be taken. But the problem is, according to the Federation of Wholesale Distribution, as reported in The Guardian yesterday, the government have only actually notified 3% of businesses. There's supposed to be 500 businesses that are exempt and should be getting these letters. It's only about 15 of them actually have. So they don't have their documentation to be able to exempt their workers or their qualified workers. Now, at this point, it might also be worth considering the wisdom of such a policy, even if it weren't being badly handled. Because I had a question on the channel yesterday. If the vaccine doesn't actually prevent you becoming infected, which it doesn't, or becoming ill, which it doesn't, or passing that infection on, which it doesn't, why should there be certain exemptions for those who are double jabbed? Well, it's about risk management. There are lots of risky things that are perfectly legal, provided the overall level of risk is below a particular bar. Like cars, for example, people die in car accidents. But we don't ban cars. What we do is make driving safer to reduce that risk. You know, we do that through manufacturing regulations so that people are more likely to survive a crash inside the car. The design of roads and signs to make people less likely to collide in the first place. Laws governing the safe use of cars, again, to prevent the collision in the first place. So although being vaccinated isn't proof against the virus, it makes you less likely to become ill. It makes you less likely to pass on the infection to someone else who could become ill. A lot less likely if you are double vaccinated. So you may have a situation like this. So let's say we let an unvaccinated population go to the pub. Well, that means we drive a huge surge in the spread of infection and tens of thousands of people will die. That's not an acceptable level of risk. But if you say, well, if we only let double jabbed people go to the pub, then the figures will come out that, yes, some people will still become infected and some people will still die. But the overall impact on the population, on the country at large, is then below that bar of acceptability. The level of death or the level of infection or serious long-term illness is brought below a particular level that is acceptable. So you introduce a system whereby you only allow double jabbed people into pubs via a vaccine passporting type system. Not that for all those who go, oh no, I don't like the sound of that. The government will not do this. Libertarians don't like that sort of thing. Nor do they like the idea of nobody going into the pub till everyone comes. Because that's what I would say. Okay, I can sort of see how we have vaccine passports that allow this activities for a certain proportion, what is now the majority of the population, to reduce the overall risk. I can get that. But if we're not going to have that, then I'm also okay with the idea as the second best option that nobody does it until everyone can do it. But that's not what libertarians think either. This is why it's so dangerous to have them deciding policy. But that is the idea. You put in place a system that reduces the risk to the overall population. That's what a risk assessment is. You identify the risk as something is now, and then you say, is that risk acceptable or not? If it's not, you put mitigating measures in place. What can you do to reduce the overall level of risk? And if you can't reduce it to an acceptable level, you can't do it. Now, it does fall down a little bit for certain industries, like pubs, for example. This same article that I was having a little read of in The Guardian talked about the failure of the government's Pingdemic policy, but it also explained that a lot of workers in pubs are at the younger end of the population. So it's all very well saying that double jabbed people are at lower risk of going to the pub if the pubs can't actually function because their staff are younger and can't be double jabbed. They haven't had the time, even the ones that have wanted to. But the general idea of lowering risk is what is informing this policy. The idea is that if workers in critical parts of our economy, like food distribution, have been double jabbed and are taking daily tests, even though it's like lateral flow tests, not the PCR test, the ones at work, then the risk is considered low enough to justify the benefits, which is an easier time getting food around the country. Now, I'm not saying this policy does reduce the risk down to an acceptable level. It may do, it may not. I haven't seen expert views on this. I'm just saying that that's the idea behind it, and the idea makes sense. It doesn't help with the driver shortage situation, because as far as I've not seen data which suggests that lots of lorry drivers are being pinged. And we knew that, we had a sudden Brexit-related shortage of about 100,000 before the pandemic was even a thing. This predates it. But it can help with other critical workers, only it's not doing. And I suspect the reason it's not doing is because this policy was not developed by the government some time ago as a contingency measure for the very predictable situation whereby we find ourselves with a severe shortage of staff in food distribution or health and social care. And it was predictable because it was predicted months ago. I talked about it months ago. If we get another surge, what's going to happen? We're going to have a lot of people being told to isolate in critical industries. We're going to have massive staff shortages. It was obvious. The government should have also thought about that. Right, let's get some contingency measures in place. That is part of the government's role, to foresee things that could cause a real problem for the population and work out a plan in advance so that it's all ready to go. If the government had paid attention to the predictions and developed these plans weeks ago, they'd have been ready to go. All of the business that were eligible would have received their documentation because it would all have been prepared well in advance, all been discussed at Cabinet, all the I's dotted, all the T's crossed. But that's not what happened. What happened was the government did nothing. They just let it do its stuff. Then one day last week, a load of newspapers went mad about shortages that have been around for weeks because they had their own COVIDiot agenda to push. The government put this scheme in place, not to deal with the problem, but to stop the headline. That was the problem for them, the headlines, not the shortages, the headlines. So of course it's been massively messed up. Shane Brennan of the Cold Chain Federation said that days after the Prime Minister told us that the food supply chain was critical and would be exempt, we still don't have a definitive list of who will be exempt and what's required of them. He went on to say that the government has done more harm than good. He said that few have confidence that those in charge have a grip on the situation, which pretty much echoes what he has been saying about the government regarding Brexit during the last couple of years, really, particularly during the transition period last year. I've mentioned him more than once or twice before, because that's the reality. This government don't have a grip on the situation. And in my opinion, the reason for this is we have a Prime Minister who lives day to day dodging the bad headlines and basking in the good ones. That's how he determines whether it's been a good day or not. What were the headlines like? Another industry leader for the Frozen Food Federation said that ministers had failed to grasp how the food supply industry worked. Again, in my view, that is another problem we've been having with this government. It's what happens when you form a government from people who are willing to get behind Brexit. To do this means it's a positive virtue to have cabinet ministers who don't know how things work. Because when you know how things work, it means knowing that Brexit is a disaster of a policy. It should therefore come as no surprise that a Brexit government cannot manage anything competently because the very qualities needed to deliver Brexit work against good governance of anything. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. Until next time, I'll see you later.